All right, good morning, class. Sorry about this morning and not being able to make Google Meets happen, at least in a live sense. I will post this video in our Google Classroom once we get wrapped up. And I also will post a second video where we look a little bit more closely at some artwork. The best way to look at artwork when we're having to learn by distance is for me to record over a PowerPoint. So I'm going to post this live link to some teaching, and then we'll have an additional presentation that I'm going to want you to look at that I thought I was going to be able to kind of show as a slideshow, but it's difficult to do that just when I'm regularly taping on my laptop. So hopefully you should hear this well, see this well, and hopefully I can get it uploaded rather quickly. So let's begin class with prayer and we'll get started. Father, I thank you for today. I ask you for the junior class right now as we have had to close it and they're having to learn from home for a few days. And I pray that nonetheless learning can go forward. I ask you for those who might not be feeling well or those who are awaiting test results. I pray that you would give them a calmness of spirit. I pray that you would restore them to health. And I pray for those who are healthy and just awaiting their return, that you would also give them patience. And we also, as the teachers in school, give us patience with the technology and with the hurdles that distance learning presents. I thank you for what you've given us, and I pray that we would learn something today as we discuss this important topic. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, I wish that we were together because this is a extremely important foundational topic for our study this year. And, we've been talking about the Italian Renaissance and this look back at the classical cultures. And in our last class, we talked a lot about Plato and his allegory of the cave, the beliefs, Socratic beliefs and the Platonic ideals that were treasured in the ancient world, or not so treasured, depending on who you were in the ancient world, and how these ideas were rediscovered and searched for through people like Petrarch, right? So what happened is that in the Renaissance period, there were a group of people who began to be very interested in reinvestigating, and that's why we think of the Renaissance as a rebirth of classical learning and ideas. And so that's why there's so much emphasis on this looking back. So was the Renaissance a forward movement or a backward movement? Well, it was a movement forward of ideas, but it certainly was a refocusing on learning ideas and inquiry of the past, specifically from the Greek and Roman civilizations. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of what all of this focus on the past, focus on the classical ideas in a lot of different areas, but a lot in the philosophy of classical Greece. And we're going to see, as we talk about various Renaissance names today, how both in philosophy, in social commentary, and then in the artists themselves, when we start to look at the actual artwork, you're going to see how much of this is related to Platonic ideals of the search for the good, true, and the beautiful, the idea that this world has a more skewed look at the forms, okay, the Platonic forms or the Platonic ideals that the allegory of the cave points everyone to. And we're going to get to see this played out in both commentary and then later in artwork. So we're going to get ready to go here. When Petrarch was doing his investigations and his digging up of these ideas, he had fellow humanists who joined him, okay? So let's talk about humanism for a second. First, sometimes we can best define something and talk about something by getting other ideas out of the way. Okay, you notice this when you're trying to define something for someone that they don't know. Like, let's say that you're trying to describe to someone, oh, have you ever tasted, buffalo meat, or have you ever had venison? And you might say it isn't like, right? You might say it tastes like chicken, kind of famously, but you might say, well, it isn't. I wouldn't describe it as the same taste as beef. I wouldn't say that it's like, right? This is a thing that we do, a definition in the negatory, right? Definition by what we don't, what we know something not to be. Let's start there for a second, because sometimes when we think about humanism, all right, and we ask ourselves, well, I've heard people say this idea of humanism, and I've asked myself the question, isn't humanism maybe something that's not good, or something that Christians don't believe in? And if you remember, if you've read your text, which I'm sure you have this chapter already, the text talks about humanism. Then it later talks about Christian humanism with Erasmus, and as humanism moved north, it becoming more synthesized with Christianity. And you might be thinking, well, I think I've had teachers, people in my life, church, tell me that humanism is a very wrong mentality. Well, let's talk about something that we're not talking about for a second, okay? In much more modern times, there emerged a philosophy called secular humanism. Okay, now secular humanism is a much more modern, much more contemporary than the Renaissance, okay, approach to humanism. And there were actual, when a philosophy or a way of thinking is established, sometimes they'll establish a manifesto, right? You've heard of the Communist Manifesto. A manifesto is like a declaration of your beliefs, an explanation of this is what makes a communist, therefore the Communist Manifesto. Well, secular humanism actually has two of its own manifestos, the Humanist Manifesto 1 and 2. And these things came out in the 70s, okay, 1970s. The secular humanism, as evidenced in those documents, basically says either there is no God, okay, it's an atheistic approach, or if there is a God, maybe more of an agnostic approach, okay, if there is a God, he doesn't really have any relevance for a daily way of looking at life or for defining anything in life, because to a secular humanist, the world is secular. It's separate from the sacred, okay? So secular humanism says there is no relevant God because humans are the very definition of all things. What humans think, what humans do, how humans view the world, the decision making, and also the moral ideas of humans are all there is, or are all that is relevant. So to a secular humanist, okay, they are not going to have at all the same emphasis as the humanists of the Renaissance. As you have already looked in your text, and we've talked just a little bit, and you watched that video on Florence, you'll notice that almost all of the artwork of the Italian Renaissance is religious in theme. This is not a group of people rejecting religion. It's not a group of atheists. Okay, and of course, the Christian humanists, who we'll add on and talk about today, were very, very interested in how faith and humanism came together. So how do we reconcile this? Well, secular humanism is different than the humanism of the Renaissance, and is certainly different than Christian humanism. So if secular humanism says humanity is the measure, man is the measure, it all falls on man's shoulders to define morality, if there is such a thing, to define right and wrong, if there is such a thing, right? But man can make the world happen, and man is capable, and man is so capable that man is the sole authority in the universe. That's secular humanism, okay? It's a rejection of really the metaphysical world in general. Okay, it's not quite naturalism, but it is to say this is all on man, and we're out here and we've got to make it, and we've got to build a world that will best prosper the humans that live in it, because we are our own light. That is not the humanism of the Renaissance, okay? So we've done our non-definition. Let's talk about what the Renaissance thinkers did believe about humanism. When you talk about Petrarch being a humanist scholar, a humanist manuscript collector, when you talk about Vasari, Castiglione, when you talk about Mirandola, and all the names that we're going to be talking about today, and you call them humanists, what do you mean by humanism? Okay, so I want you to write this definition down. So in the Italian Renaissance, humanism, all right, it basically states that human nature and human achievements, so that's both things, right? Human nature and human achievements, evidenced, right, in the classics, as evident in the classics, because remember, a big part of Renaissance humanism is, again, looking back at the classics, the ideas, the artwork, the mathematics, the investigation of the ancient world were worthy of contemplation. All right? Human nature and achievements, evident in the classics, were worthy of contemplation. That's what it meant to be a humanist in this period. It's a person like Petrarch that says, there's something good about looking back and talking about what humans think and can accomplish. Now, just slightly contrasting this, okay, to the Middle Ages, as we talked about in the Middle Ages, the emphasis was much more on God, his church, and the authority of religious bodies, okay, rather than on one human individual and what they can do. The emphasis in the Middle Ages was much more on what God is doing and what God is doing through his visible church in the world. It does not mean that there was no intellectual inquiry for 1,000 years, okay? Although, as we've talked about, intellectual inquiry for a lot of common people was severely hampered by the Black Death, constant war, famine, need to survive, and all of those things. So the Renaissance, especially in Italy, we've got money, we've got leisure, we've got capitalism, we've got people with money to spend, we have political competition where city-state rulers and Medicis and other bankers and other capitalist merchants are looking to make names for themselves. And therefore, they're going to support intellectual inquiry, they're going to support the arts, they're going to support the collection of manuscripts, and all of these things. So when we think about humanism, okay, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about a movement that says, hey, humans do have something to say, and their inquiry and their thought and even their poetry, right? Petrarch was a writer of poetry, and he was said to have fallen in love with this woman named Laura. Now, Laura was a married woman. And so this is not a modern affairs scandal. Laura was more of a muse or an inspiration to Petrarch. And like we talked about, Petrarch was a very emotional person. And so he had this idea that, well, he was in love with Laura, but this was a thing that could never be because she was a married woman. And so he spent his life inspired by the ideal of Laura in finding maybe a person that could inspire the same love or feeling or devotion that she could. All right, you can see this as you're studying your British literature in the idea of if you've gotten to Gawain and the Green Knight yet, right? This idea of the devotion to a lady. Right, I devote myself to this lady. This lady, she may be married, right, to a lord, but she is the person that I take on as my inspiration when I go to battle. She has some kind of set of characteristics of goodness, of virtue, of beauty that inspire me on the battlefield. You can see some of that with Joan of Arc, right, in the 100 Years' War. And so when you contemplate these humanists, they had a number of things that they were interested in doing, in reading about, and they made political commentary. You remember from your reading that, for instance, Cicero, he had made political commentary about that Rome was going the wrong way. That, yes, the Romans were establishing an empire, and that this empire was great, and it was mighty, and it was rich, and it was powerful, and it was conquering other lands. But what did Cicero want Rome to return to? Do you remember? You should be saying Cicero recommended the return of Rome to a republic, a simpler time, because he believed that the Roman Republic represented the best of Rome for humanity, not the empire of Rome. And so these thinkers that the Renaissance people looked back to, right? They were inspired by the ideas of the past, whether Plato's political ideas, Cicero's political ideas, right? And sometimes they took them in one direction, or sometimes they took them in another. So let's talk about a priest, okay? This is an Italian priest by the name of Ficino. Okay, now Ficino, he believed that one of the most important works of the Renaissance were Plato's dialogues. Okay, remember we talked about the dialogues the other day. Plato's dialogues are a recording, okay, a recording, probably somewhat fictional or at least amplified and added to, of the dialogues that Socrates would have had with the people of his day. And the object of the dialogues is always to be a gadfly, to use Socratic questioning to get to a higher truth, to get the person that's being talked to in the dialogue to a point where they're wrestling with what is justice, goodness, beauty, truth, loyalty. It's higher order thinking. Ficino felt that Plato's dialogues were extremely important for instructing people about the contemplatory nature that humans should have. What Ficino is saying is, and by the way, Ficino is a priest. He became a priest in Italy. He's not some kind of secular humanist that doesn't believe in God, okay? What he says is these dialogues and the things that they're getting at and the kind of thinking that's required, they are good for people and they should be available to people. And so Plato's dialogues were translated to Latin by Ficino, to a language, the language of the educated, yes, but to a language that could be read, okay? So they were translated, and they were also, once 1450 came about, they were also printed and published for the people of the Renaissance and the people beyond that time to contemplate. And he thought of these Platonic ideals as extremely important. Now, for Ficino, he believed that the idea of the Platonic forms, the idea of the Platonic ideals, was very much related to Christianity. Looking at your text, I'm on page 379 here as it talks about Ficino. He says he attempted to synthesize Christian and Platonic teachings. Remember, we talked about Socrates, Plato. These people were not Christians, but just like we saw in our last class, and hopefully you ended up talking about that with Mr. Eckert later in the day too, there's certainly a lot of truth that's coming about these ideas. And so it says Plato's emphasis on spiritual and eternal over the material world, right? The world of the shadows, what's really real, what really matters, what really is the real world. Ficino says this is a perfect idea that ties in with Christianity. Platonic ideas about love, right, about perfect beauty, can be easily interpreted as the Christian desire for the perfection of God. So when Plato says, look to the forms, when Plato says, look to the ideals, What Ficino and others who follow him are saying is, yes, look to the forms and ideals, but know that those forms and ideals are in the mind of, that they are in the very person of God. And so is humanism a movement that's against God and religion, or is it tying into religious faith and inquiry? Well, as humanism develops, we have to ask that question. It's important to know that humanism did not reject God and faith, but it did say there needs to be more of an emphasis on individuals and what they can do and what they can be, and probably more important, on what they can become. So let's talk about another name from your chapter. Okay, this is a super important name for us. So one of Ficino's students is Pico della Mirandola. So let me write his name down for us. Okay, this is a student of Ficino's. And Mirandola, he studied the works of his teacher, and he continued to theorize from those works about the importance of man and about the importance of inquiry and about the importance of the pursuit of the truth. And so he developed an idea about man. Here's where we start to get into whether this is true and whether or not Christians would agree with this. But here's Mirandola's take. Okay, he basically says man functions in this world, which is an imperfect world, yes. But because man is an image bearer, because man is created in the image of God, and of course Ficino emphasized this, then man living in this world has a very, very important choice to make. Okay, so you can see both religion, man made in the image of God, right? And you can see the emphasis on man, man's choice about who he's going to become and how he's going to turn out. And so Mirandola says, here's man in the world, okay? And man, as an image bearer, is an agent of choice, decision making. He is a moral being. He is a capable being. And so he says, man, in choosing the way that he will live, can either ascend to the realm of angels. In other words, he can ascend and worry about and contemplate and think about and concentrate on the world of the forms, okay? Or he can descend to the realm of animals. He says man has a choice. And this choice, he puts quite a bit on man's shoulders. And this is because the Renaissance emphasized man's individual capability. Okay? And so that emphasis is seen in Mirandola's idea. He says, what do you want to do, mankind? Do you want to push yourself toward the higher? Do you want to contemplate the world of ideals? Or do you want to stay locked down in that cave and just look at a world of shadows? And he says, if you concentrate solely on the world of shadows, you will descend to the realm of animals, because you will never contemplate a greater justice, truth, beauty, a greater right or wrong. You will only be attracted to a world that is transient, passing, and not even really real. And so this idea of what can man do in the world is really important. And it even extends into more modern philosophical inquiry. You know, there was a kind of a big debate that went on about whether or not man as an image bearer. And we won't have time to talk about this, but it is a very interesting debate on the image of man. We always talk about man as an image bearer, right? Man is made in the image of God. And therefore, and this is what the Renaissance humanists believe, therefore, as being made an image bearer of God, man is given dignity by God. He doesn't earn dignity. He is given dignity. He is endowed by his creator, right? You hear that verbiage in the Declaration of Independence. He's given this dignity. It's innate because he is a creature made by God and then breathed into with the breath of life by God. And so man has this natural dignity. And man is not like God in every way, but he is like God with some communicable attributes. There's probably lots that you're hearing like, oh, I remember this. I remember this from Bible. I remember this. Okay, so I hope that's happening. So man as an image bearer and as an agent of choice, okay, has decisions to make, has things to do. Now, when we get a little bit more into the Reformation, we'll talk about this choice and how much free will we have, but I don't want to get too much into that stuff right now, okay? So as we discuss this idea of man's capability and what he's going to do or not do, some people even in modern times have asked themselves, well, if man chooses to descend to the realm of animals, this is really important to think about and ask questions about. We can talk about it more when we can dialogue. But could man ever lose his image-bearing qualities? What do you think the Bible would say about that? If we're saying man as an image bearer, right, can ascend to the realm of angels through his choices, or he can descend to the realm of animals through his choices. If man descends to the realm of an animal, does he lose his image-bearing quality? Can he lose the stamp of image-bearing that God has put on him and truly become an animal? One Christian philosopher talked about this concept, and he referred to people who made this fall from image bearing. He called them a trousered ape. What he's saying is, it's a man, okay? It's a man wearing pants, but he's descended to the realm of animals through his choices and neglect of the spiritual world and the truths. He has become one of the animals. He may wear pants, he may function like a human, but he's no longer acting as an image bearer and maybe isn't an image bearer. Other philosophers debate this and they say there's no way that anyone can ever lose the image of God that he's created in. He can mar it, he can work against it, he can try to ignore it, but no, the image of God is always retained in a human, because in the very essence of humanity is an indelible image of God. And so that's an interesting debate that we could think about and talk about. But the humanists of the Renaissance, they did believe that man's choices and his pursuits were extremely important. So think about this. If you believe that your pursuits and your choices and the things that you focus on in life are largely determiners of whether you're, as a human, reaching heights or you're reaching for the lows, going down to the dregs, then your purposes and what you do become very important. So you see how there's this emphasis on man that's emerging, right? Before, it's an emphasis on what God is doing. When you walk into that Gothic cathedral, you're looking up and you're thinking about what God is doing in the world. You're thinking about what God is, his message to you. You're not necessarily thinking about your response. But as we get into Renaissance art, you're going to see that individuals are having altarpieces made for their homes. Yes, it's for a chapel in their homes. It is for worship. But think about that difference between walking into a Gothic cathedral that's so overwhelming that it makes you look up and you feel small and you say, I'm going to sit down right here and I'm just going to contemplate my insignificance in the universe, versus your own chapel built in your own home, and it's by a famous Renaissance artist, and you say to people, look at my chapel in my home, and this is where I worship and I contemplate God, and it's a personal relationship and it's very individual for me and my family. That's a big difference. I'm not saying that people in the Renaissance didn't go to churches or cathedrals, but I'm talking about that mentality of emphasis that changes, okay? And so man's importance in the Renaissance, the view of man's importance is definitely on the way up. And out of that came an idea that we want to talk about for a moment. Important that you write down this idea, the idea of virtue, okay? Okay, let's talk about this idea. This idea of virtue, it's been a little bit difficult to translate because, of course, a lot of people look at this and they immediately think of virtue. And when we think about a virtuous person, we think about a moral person, a person who is virtuous. They know the difference between right and wrong, and they seek right and they seek good over evil. Okay, a virtuous person, a person who pursues virtue. Virtue is a different idea. The idea of virtue was brought about by it was discussed in Machiavelli's work. It was also discussed in Alberti Vasari's work. And the idea of virtue means that you have the ability to shape what's around you. The man or woman of virtue is a shaper. Okay? The reason that we could say that they have virtue is because they're doing something to change, alter, shape, direct the people around them, the culture around them, to something that matters. Okay, so a person of virtue is a person who influences the world around them. They're not just sitting there taking things as they come, okay, and saying, well, I guess this is just, what's happening to me. Roll with it, right? Roll with the punches. Take it easy. Don't stress out. No bad days. All the t-shirts that we see, right? Chill out, relax. Don't get too excited about it. That's not the view of a person who is pursuing virtue. Virtue is saying, get out there, influence, shape, be a person who others listen to about what matters in the world, okay? And so Vasari, he writes about people's lives that he believes show this quality of virtue. Vasari's work, the lives of most excellent painters, sculptors, and architects. Why are these people's lives most excellent? Because they paint something? No, because their architecture, their sculpture, their visual arts, their paintings shape people's thinking, people's mentality, people's contemplation. When a virtuous artist like Da Vinci or Raphael or Botticelli paints, it causes contemplation, thinking, right, toward things of a higher world. And the person of virtue, Vasari says, is a person who can truly claim excellence because they are a shaping person, because they are a person that shapes others, because they are a person who matters. Now, how do you get to matter? All right, here's the difference between the Renaissance ideal and perhaps the ideals of today. We want to talk about this idea that emerged out of the Renaissance as we started thinking about all these ways that we could be. How do you become a shaper? How do you become someone of virtue? How do you become someone great, someone influential, someone, okay, let's talk about this. You got to think about today for a minute to contrast with the Renaissance ideas, okay? So let's say a modern mentality. When I say modern, I don't mean modern in the 1300s, although that's also getting close to modern, if not modern. I mean a 2020 view, okay? Let's talk about a 2020 view of greatness. So we all know the stories. Now, let me just stop here for a second, okay? Before I get started here, I am not saying that someone shouldn't pursue the Olympics, okay? Or becoming a professional athlete or becoming a professional, anything for that matter. But I want to contrast the mentality for a minute. So just everybody relax and listen, okay? All right, so let's think about this. It's 2020 and you're the parents, okay, or grandparents of a 3-year-old. And that 3-year-old shows unusual promise in the area of golf or at the gymnastics center, or they seem to pick up on music very easily, and you hand them a violin and you say, boy, they really seem to be almost naturally just be taking to this. And so let's say that one of these scenarios is playing out at your home, right? What do? Well, the modern 2020 mentality is, well, let's get started, right? Let's get this 3-year-old in golf lessons. Let's get this gymnast into one of the best places in the country for training. Let's get this kid on the violin and let's start taking lessons, right? And let's say that lasts about 6 months, because once you start the lessons or the training or the learning, you realize, oh my gosh, this kid really knows what they're doing. They might be a virtuoso. They might be able to make the big leagues. They might be able to become, right? And so you say, all right, what's the next step? Now this kid is 3.5 years old. They're almost 4. You are slacking. You got to get on the stick. Yeah, they're taking local gymnastics lessons, but we've got to find out where the best gyms in the country are, and we have to move our family to that gym, right? Because we're going to put all our eggs in this basket, and we're going to make sure that this kid's talents are used properly. Same thing with that violinist. We've got to sell the family home and get the best violin instructor, and we got to figure out where all the other violinists are that we're competing against, and we got to sell our goods, and we got to sell our home, and we got to hire the best. And if we need to hire that person away from one of these other 4-year-olds, we shall definitely do so, right? And that golfer, we're going to get him in training. We're going to get an optimal diet. Okay, we're going to find out what the greatest golfers have been eating and drinking and where they go and what courses, and we're just going to get these kids started, because we should have been starting this when they were 2, if only we had known, right? So today's mentality is very much like this, okay? We find this talent or this interest and we just say, let's go, right? All eggs in this basket. This is what this person is destined to be. And how can we make this person great? And our idea many times of greatness is going after this one thing in a single-minded mindset. Have you ever seen interviews with Olympic athletes? And they talk about, I dropped out of school. I homeschool in the morning. I have a tutor that comes in at 4 a.m., right? And this tutor works with me between 4 a.m. and 5:30. And then I go to the pool, right? And I swim from 5:30 a.m. to 9:30. And then I go and do a couple more hours of school, but then I'm back in the pool, right? I do 3 to 5 day a week practices. I monitor my diet. I change my lifestyle. My parents separated and live across the country so that I can be with this trainer, right? It's a very, very, very one-note mentality. You can see that at the Olympic level, and you can even see it just at local levels, right? People who say, I'm going to pursue this club team, I'm putting all my eggs in this basket, right? Or I'm looking to get recruited. I'm out there, I'm selling myself. It's not just athletics. It can also be in the arts. We don't see as much of that in this area, but there are certainly places in the country where that's the emphasis, right? Or even with little children, we might have parents that say, well, Jimmy, he just loves dinosaurs, and so we make and there's nothing wrong with having a room theme of dinosaurs, okay? But what I'm trying to get to you is a mentality where we say he only wants to read books about dinosaurs. He's only interested in science. He is only interested in archaeology and science and inquiry in this area. So is there a school someplace where I can take my child that's showing this interest at 5 and really capitalize it? Is there a dinosaur school where, we don't really have to waste time with things that he's not going to be interested in, and he's not going to go into that career? So why should he have to read, Curious George or Shakespeare for that matter? Because his thing is dinosaurs, and we see this emerging, and so we want to capitalize it. We want to get him in the dinosaur school, and we'll do whatever it takes to fan the flames of this natural interest that this young man or young woman is showing, right? This is not the thinking of the Renaissance. The Renaissance whole entire approach, my friends, in the excellent painters, sculptors, and architects, was that a person have a wide berth of knowledge, a wide foundation for living. Even if they ended up being a most excellent sculptor, guess what? Before they were a most excellent sculptor, they had to know something about the sculpture that they produced. When we get into the art part of the lecture, you're going to see sculptures of David. You're going to see paintings of the Last Supper. And you'll notice that with the detail put into paintings, with the detail put into sculpture, with the detail put into architecture, that these people had to know something about mathematics, weight bearing. They had to know something about the Bible. They had to know something about the lives of the disciples. They had to know something about faith. They had to know something about philosophy, or else these works never could have been created. It wasn't just about art technique. It was about having something to say so that your technique, right, doesn't hold you back from expressing a greater truth. And we're going to get to see, as we learn to look at artwork, some of the messaging behind the Last Supper and why it's painted like it is. Yes, there's technique. When we look at the Last Supper, we'll learn about a new type of painting technique that Da Vinci was trying. And unfortunately, it didn't work out that well, and the painting is largely disintegrated, okay? But we're also going to talk about the messaging and the Renaissance influence, because within the Last Supper, there is a look at the Platonic ideals. And so contrasting a modern mentality with the Renaissance mentality, we can think of this term called a Renaissance man, okay? A Renaissance man. What does it mean to be a Renaissance man? A Renaissance man is not just someone who lives in the Renaissance, okay? And it's not just a most excellent painter or sculptor or architect. It is a person who drinks deeply from the well of human contemplation and believes that they believe in humanism. Okay, they believe that the works and achievements of mankind in many areas are worth contemplating. Now, let me read you something that Alberti said about himself. I'm looking on page 380 if you've got your text and you're following along, okay? And remember, he's talking about himself in the third person, okay? I won't make any commentary about that, but he's writing about his achievements, okay? Now, Alberti was an artist. He was an artist, but I want you to listen to the things that he says, okay, about himself when he is writing about his accomplishments. Hopefully I can see this because I don't have my glasses with me. Assiduous in the science and skill of dealing with arms and horses and musical instruments, as well as in pursuit of letters. And by letters, he means the classics. The man of letters, okay, is the man of humanist manuscripts, ancient manuscripts, and the fine arts. He, Alberti, was devoted to the knowledge of the most strange and difficult things. He played ball, hurled the javelin, ran, leapt, wrestled. He learned music without teachers, and then turned to physics and the mathematical arts. Ambition was alien to him. When his favorite dog died, he wrote a funeral oration for him. Okay, so how does Alberti describe himself? Well, he describes himself as a Renaissance man, and what he says is, I excel, I pursue, yes, letters, yes, the humanities, manuscripts, that's what I do. And essentially that's what he did for a living. But I pursue physical health and greatness and excellence. I pursue horses and arms dealing. I know about weapons. I know about horse breeding. I know about artwork. Yes, I know about mathematics. I pursue what's difficult. I teach myself a musical instrument. I don't go get a teacher and say, I think I'm pretty good at this. Let's see where we can take it. I pursue a musical instrument, and it's not so that I can become a great violinist and get a big fat violinist paycheck. Nothing here is about getting a job. And to our modern mentality, sometimes we see that as, okay, this just seems kind of like unrealistic. Because so much of what I'm talking about in the 2020 mentality is about using these talents, abilities to get yourself the good job, the right job, or the paycheck and endorsements, right? Now, I'm not saying that no one in the Renaissance cared about money. That would be silly to say. They had money, to be frank. That's why they could pursue these things. You can't be teaching yourself a musical instrument if you're worried about starving to death, okay? So money is not a bad thing, and having a job is not a bad thing. It's honorable and good. But the Renaissance man is saying you pursue, the idea of the Renaissance man is an ideal to be pursued. And the Renaissance man is not primarily about check out his job or do you know what I make? I make this. Okay? The Renaissance man is about a broad-based, liberal, we're going to get to that word now, liberal or human education. Education for humans. Education for humans. Not education primarily for workers. And there is a difference, and we're going to be talking about this all year. There is a difference between education for humans and education solely to become a worker. All humans should work, and all humans should find employment. That's certainly biblical. But the idea of how can we produce workers is a very different mentality. And let me tell you something, we're going to see this played out in history. We're going to see it played out in secular France. We're going to see it played out in the colonies. When Europeans colonized the rest of the world, some places they colonized had a mentality of education for humans, for the people who lived in these colonies. Some people had a mentality of education for workers, and what they put into their curriculums and what they allowed in their curriculums, far different, right? In totalitarian nations, when Italy became fascist, when the Nazis took over in Germany, when the Soviets took over in Russia, what did they believe about education and the purpose of man? You know what? It's the difference between education for workers and education for humans. So this idea of humanism often includes what we call the liberal arts. The liberal arts. Some people get very scared when they hear the word liberal, or maybe you're on the opposite side of the political spectrum and you think, oh, good liberals, I love them. Okay, we're not talking about progressive liberalism in a modern political context. What we want out of this word, liberal, is the root that's here. Liber, right? We want to talk about liberty. Do you know what the liberal arts are? The liberal arts are the study, the arts for the free man, for the free man, the man who's free to pursue intellectual inquiry. If you are a slave that was gotten through the spoils of war, and you work for an empire like the Roman Empire to produce for the citizens of Rome, you are not a free man, right? If you're a servant who has to spend all day working and scraping together for a living, you are not a free man. The liberal arts means arts or the study for freemen, for people who are not in a position of either economic or intellectual slavery. And it's the idea that man, as an image bearer, should be allowed to pursue the liberal arts. Now, I am not talking about which major you take in college quite yet, okay? I'm talking about whether or not you have the freedom in your life, the freedom that has been given to you as an image bearer and accorded to you by your circumstances and by the society in which you live, and how it defines education. Do you have the freedom to study and memorize poetry? Do you have the freedom to learn about science and math? Or does someone come in and say, no, you know what? You seem like a big burly guy. You don't need to learn these things. We're going to put you as a ditch digger. Okay? What about on opposite sides of it? What about in countries where people were selected for hockey teams or ballet troupes because their bodies, right, looked like they would work well. And so they're just co-opted and say, well, you're going to do this for the glory of the state. Are they a free man? Right? The free man pursues many different ideas of intellectual inquiry. And here's the thing. To the people in the Renaissance, if we were to put it in our modern context, okay? To the people of the Renaissance, the purpose of your education is not so much about your job, because that's going to come for an educated person, okay? It's not so much about your job as it is what you think about when you're not at your job. Yes, you will bring your education to your job and you will apply these skills and ideas. But what about when you turn the lights out at your office or at the mechanic shop at the end of the day and you go back home and you dialogue with your wife and child? What about when you're in church? What about when you're at a museum? What about when you are talking with a friend? Do you have the intellectual resources to draw on things that make life better? And by the way, it makes life better at the job too, because while you're waiting for the oil to drain out of the car that you're working on, what is there for you to contemplate, to think about? And when you're working in the mechanic shop, how do you know whether you're treating people fairly, with dignity, well, rightly, truthfully? Well, you know it from the ideas of fairness, honesty, beauty, truth that you've gained from your liberal education, from the education of a free man. You didn't learn it from page 102 on being a mechanic. You learned about what's honorable from stories about knights, not from page 102 of your Mechanic's Guide to Ethics. You learned about how to be a good father from poetry and art and biblical inquiry, not on your job, okay? And so these things don't discount the importance of getting a job. They don't say that to be a true person of the liberal arts that you need to go into $200,000 of debt for a degree that you can't use. I know there's a lot of sensitivity about that in our culture today, and even amongst parents. The idea that, why should my child go into $200,000 of debt for a degree that they can't use and doesn't get them anything? Well, going into $200,000 of debt for college isn't exactly being a free man, because now you're a slave to that debt, and the kind of job that you'll have to take to pay that back isn't freedom. And yet, we can have this mentality that says, how do I get this coursework that isn't relevant or isn't about the real world out out of my way. You know that phrasing? How do I just take it early? How do I, look, let's talk about this AP class. Are you taking this AP class so that you can get a 5 on the AP exam and have one class you have to take and just get into your job faster? Or are you taking this AP class to have a wealth of knowledge, something to say about the world, to learn about a place that you haven't learned that much about, to bring things to bear in your life through faith, and to think about ideas, and to be a well-informed and educated person? And will this class help you in your job? Yes. And will passing the AP exam maybe get you through one credit, one class of college, 3 credit hours, maybe 6 if the college is generous? Great, that's wonderful. I think the AP system of letting you take something else in college, but let me just say this to you. Instead of maybe thinking about how the AP class can get you through faster, it also can allow you to take a course that otherwise you couldn't fit into your schedule. To take an art course, to take a course on gardening when that's not even your major, but it's something that you want to pursue in your life. To take a higher math and challenge yourself, even if you're not going to be a mathematician. Or to get more focused. Maybe in your career path that you're pursuing, you want to get into pediatrics, and maybe there's a class along the way that's about a specific pediatric disease in a certain region of the world, and you don't have time to fit into your schedule. And maybe the fact that you passed AP European opens up one class in your life where you can become a better doctor. Yes, better at your job, but also better for humanity, better for the world that God created. That's a liberal arts education. It doesn't mean throwing away work. It doesn't mean going into debt. It doesn't mean pursuing worthless things. It means understanding what has worth and value for humans created in the image of God, right? That's what these Renaissance people were getting at. And I want to close with just talking about Castiglione for just a minute and his work, The Courtier. If you remember, the text talked about this work as I don't want to put quotes there, I want to underline. Okay, this is italicized. Baldassare Castiglione. Maybe Castiglione. The Courtier, right? This was his book that basically said, what does an educated Renaissance man look like? And remember in the text, it talked about how this book was published in many, many different languages, right? Translated into every European language and widely read. It influenced the patterns and conduct of elite groups in the Renaissance and was considered a how-to manual. A how-to manual for people seeking to improve themselves and rise in the social hierarchy. What did he say that the courtier should be able to do? It's a little bit similar to what Alberti Vasari said about himself. The courtier isn't just a person who knows how to behave himself at the king's court or the Italian prince's court so that he can stay around. Right? He says this is a Renaissance man. The courtier can serve several different rulers. You know, Leonardo da Vinci, he served a lot of different rulers. He served a lot of different patrons in his time. And he needed to be able to adjust to their differing desires and their differing mentalities. Listen to what Castiglione says about what a courtier should be, right? A broad background, write some of these things down, please, in many academic subjects, spiritual and physical, as well as intellectual, right? Man is not just a body. Man is not just a mind. And man is not just a soul, not here on this earth. All of these things need to come into play. You know what? In one of Socrates' dialogues, he meets up with one of his students. And Plato writes in this dialogue, Socrates comes across one of his students, and the student is fat and out of shape. And he says to the student, you know, what's wrong with you? Why do you look so pudgy? Why do you look so bad? Right? He says this to one of his Socratic followers. And the student says, oh, Socrates, it's okay. Right now, I'm not training for the games, right? He's making reference to the games, of course, that were held in the ancient world. And he says, right now, I'm not pursuing the games. So I'm just kind of taking some time off of all my physical training. And yeah, I'm getting kind of, paunchy around the gut, but it's okay because I'm not working toward the games right now. They're not for a while. And so I don't have to worry about it. And Socrates challenges him Socratically, and he says, but wait a minute, is the purpose of your body and its training only the games, only a laurel wreath that quickly passes? And he says, it is a great shame for a young person to never see what their body can do and to never know the capabilities of one's body because, hey, I'm off training right now, or I didn't make the team. Physical training isn't about the next step. It's about recognizing the greatness of God, right, as we Christian humanists would say, in our own bodies and the way they were created. It's pretty cool stuff, right? Castiglione envisioned a man who could compose a sonnet and wrestle, sing a song and accompany himself on an instrument, I'm on page 381, ride expertly, solve difficult mathematical problems, and above all, speak and write eloquently, right? For women, these things looked a little bit different, but they should be able to run a household. They should be able to dance. They should be able to play musical instruments. They should be able to do artwork. And this was an idea of both Renaissance man and Renaissance woman. And the idea that a person who would be welcome at court, a person of influence, a person with virtue, to tie it all together, is a person with something to offer, okay? And all men and women, even though this promise was not carried out to all men and women because it was largely available to those who could afford it, but the idea still remained that all men and women as image bearers are capable and through God's image are worthy of having this invested in them. Whether you believe that or not will make a big difference in your modern educational theories about what children should be taught, who should be taught what, how they should be divided and tracked, and it has major implications. We'll continue to talk about these this year. I'm going to move off of this lecture. We'll post some commentary over some specific artwork that we'll get to look at. And I'll also post a couple videos that I'm going to have you choose from. There's a great thing, you might have seen it before, it's called Smart History, where they look at an actual work and do some commentary on it. I'm going to post some of those to Google Classroom for you to look at over the next couple of days. And hopefully we'll be back together soon. Thanks for your attention today, and sorry about the live lecture. I wish we could have done this differently, but maybe next time we'll get it worked out. We'll do our best. Okay, thanks. Have a good day.